You see, as I mentioned, Haida Gwaii was one of my first trips as Liberal leader. And I can't think of any place more appropriate for one of my very last. Sorry. You guys, this...
Yeah, it's sad. Why is Trudeau crying? We'll come back with some possible solutions. And wait for it. The interview you have been wanting to hear. You've been asking me to do this. We spoke with Danielle Smith. This is an interview you can't miss. We'll be right back with more. We need political change. But we also need to resolve to resist. So why was Trudeau crying? Is he crying because the Epstein list is on the verge of being released? And I tell you, if Justin Trudeau or Mark Carney are on that Epstein list, I'll be back again in a couple of hours with another broadcast. We're waiting to see that. Trudeau could be crying because an access to information request revealed that Jody Wilson-Raybould, when she was Justice Minister and Attorney General, wanted the RCMP to investigate deeper and further into the SNC-Lavalin scandal. Or is Justin Trudeau really sad that Pat King did not get sent to jail for 10 years? Lots of reasons for Justin Trudeau to be crying. It's not because he loves the Haida people so much. No, that's not the reason, because we know how he feels about people. He kicks people under the bus. Women, minorities, black people. He does blackface for years. He's a hypocrite. He doesn't care for anybody but himself. He never has. He's the classic narcissist. That's Justin Trudeau. So we've got a couple of things to deal with before I get to the interview, but I can't wait. And by the way, before I forget, like the station right now if you can. Subscribe if you haven't. We appreciate it. It means so much. We're on the verge of 40,000. I want to see 50,000 in a couple of months. We're going to move upward and onwards. Thank you so much for supporting the station. You might have to resubscribe. A lot of people find they have to do that. But I want to clear up a few things here. And this is all very, very fascinating. But do you think Justin Trudeau, and this is a post I put out on X, was crying this because he knew the access to information was about to come out, that former MP and Attorney General Jody Wilson-Raybould, who is Haida, had reportedly advised the MP to widen the scope of the SNC-Lavalin probe. But the RCMP refused to investigate further. So, if you're seeing YouTubers out there saying, Trudeau busted, it's not true. In fact, it's the kind of disinformation the Liberal government likes to target, and so they can start saying everything on YouTube is disinformation. So, no, it's not true. He's not being busted. The RCMP is not reopening the investigation. Let's find out what's really happening. And, I'm sick of clickbait. You don't see clickbait on my station because it is lies. Breaking. Advocate applies for private prosecution of Trudeau and SNC-Lavalin. This is my friend Sam Cooper at the Bureau. Once again, I encourage you to read Sam's work on the Bureau. He was on the show just the other day talking about the crisis. And that's all I'm going to say. The RCMP conducted a very superficial investigation into the cabinet's interference. Duff Conacher, who I'd like to have on the show as well, he's the co-founder of Democracy Watch. They are asking for an investigation into this. They didn't interview many key witnesses or obtain critical cabinet records, then decided not to prosecute anyone behind closed doors. We believe a judge must see this evidence in court. Newly released RCMP transcripts indicate that senior officials, including Trudeau's then Principal Secretary Gerald Butts, repeatedly pressed Wilson-Raybould to override prosecutors and grant SNC-Lavalin a deferred prosecution agreement. So that's what's going on here. Let's see. Get to the last slide. Democracy Watchers will say The document alleges that the RCMP applied an improper legal standard for obstruction of justice and never considered breach of trust. This is what I have been saying for the past 2 years. The RCMP is in the pocket of Justin Trudeau. You can't trust them to do a proper investigation. They don't do it anymore if it involves Justin Trudeau or the Liberal government. I question their credibility as a national police organization. I do that because the evidence suggests that. This is an access to information request that Democracy Watch received, saying SNC-Lavalin scandal was never properly investigated. The group contends that the RCMP relied on self-interested public statements, omitted key witness interviews, including those of then Health Minister Jane Philpott, and accepted the Cabinet's refusal to disclose pivotal communications. The RCMP covered up its investigation. And, you know, it's incredible to me. By the way, SNC-Lavalin, and this is Trudeau announcing a high-speed train service between where? Toronto and Quebec City? Who the hell is going to Quebec City anymore? Who's going to Montreal? What about Ottawa to Toronto? What about Toronto to Niagara Falls? What about Calgary to Edmonton? What about Calgary to Vancouver? There's a lot of other routes that should have been considered for this high-speed rail. But who do you think is going to get the contract? Would it be SNC-Lavalin? But SNC-Lavalin has changed its name. It's now Atkins Realis. Isn't that something? Now, want to shift here to something else. This is incredible. This is our Heritage Minister, Pascal Saint-Onge, announcing yesterday that CBC should have guaranteed funding and it should be doubled. I'm sorry, doubled. Where did this come from? Why should we be doubling the CBC's funding? Well, because it should have more responsibilities. It should be responsible for monitoring disinformation. Although the CBC is probably one of the greatest purveyors of disinformation in the country because it represents the government. Yes, they've done some good news stories. I'm not going to say it's all disinformation, but who watches the CBC anyway? And it does produce a lot of government propaganda. It's done that over the years. But listen to what Saint-Onge says here. CBC should be getting more money, and what the hell should Parliament be voting on it for? Because we don't even need a Parliament. Just keep it prorogued for the rest of the age. Just keep Parliament out there. Keep Parliament suspended until somebody thinks we might have to bring them back. But what? Don't bring them back to approve CBC's budget. Give them $2 billion a year instead of the 1.3. Listen to this woman.
The existence of our public broadcaster depends on a single line in the budget. I'm proposing that we remove the decision-making around funding from the political cycles, whether it's the elections or the budget. Many countries around the world have chosen that path in giving their public broadcaster predictable, viable, and stable funding.
So we shouldn't even ask Parliament whether it's okay to give CBC another $1 billion. Automatic. Make it automatic, just like they do in Europe. Yeah, they're doing things so well in Europe, they're cracking down on free speech, just like Justin Trudeau wants to do. And he wants the CBC to monitor whether we have too much free speech in this country and whether there's too much disinformation.
CBC does not belong to the Liberals. It does not belong to the Conservatives.
It belongs to the Liberals. It belongs to woke people. That's who controls the CBC. Look at the people at the top. They are all Liberal Party supporters. They're all woke ideologists.
And it does not belong to any other political parties. It belongs to the Canadian people. And this is why, to be able to give CBC Radio-Canada the means to fulfill its mandate, I propose that it be financed directly in the legislation instead of in the budget through statutory appropriation. Statutory appropriation should be based on the demographic reality. And I mean by that a per capita funding based formula. The average funding for a public broadcaster in a G7 country is $62 per person per year. In Canada, we're second to last, with $33 per year per person.
So you're not paying enough for CBC. If you're paying $33 per capita, which is overspending as it is, she wants you to spend double that, $66 per person.
We're closer to the United States than to any other country of the G7 country. And I don't think that we want the United States to be our reference. I think we need to aim closer to the middle ground, which is $62 per year per person. Canadians need to have access to reliable, factual sources of information that are available across the country and not be misled by false information during those emergency situations. CBC Radio-Canada, by virtue of its size and geographic reach, must have a clear mandate to disseminate this information using its infrastructure, whether it's radio, TV, or web. So I'm proposing that we anchor that new role directly in the legislation, the role that CBC must play in case of national emergencies. Enshrined in law, the role that CBC Radio-Canada plays in the fight against disinformation to support the public, especially in the current context. And this refers directly to some of the recommendations that were made by the Foreign Interference Commission, which repeated how important it is that Canadians can rely on Canadian sources of information to be more resilient and to understand the patterns that other countries use to disseminate propaganda or disinformation to influence how we live together and our political context. And this is why I propose to anchor in CBC Radio-Canada's mandate its role in helping the Canadian population fight against disinformation and understand fact-based information.
Thank you so much, Minister Stanong. So CBC will now be telling me what is truth and what is lies, what is truth and what is propaganda, what is misinformation and what is disinformation. You want CBC telling you that? Let's tell this minister to go to hell. Let's get rid of this Liberal government. Let's have new elections. Let's have a credible, legitimate federal government. Let's have a new government because this government is bankrupt. All right. Transition time, folks. Let's move to the moment you've all been waiting for. This was a pleasure talking to somebody I have known for decades. I've said that for a long time. This interview proves it. It was such a pleasure to do this interview. I hope you all enjoy watching and listening as much as I enjoyed conducting it. Here it is. Today on Stand on Guard, and it's such a pleasure to have an old friend. Yes, believe it or not, we go back to the Calgary Herald together. Premier Danielle Smith. And Premier, so nice to have you with me today. And I said one time, I was working for Politico at the time, and I said, and you were with Wild Rose at that time, and I said, Danielle Smith is going to be the Premier of Alberta, and she's going to be the best damn Premier that province ever had. Took a few years for that to happen, but it's happened, and you are just doing a fantastic job. And the Premier of a province that is a mover and shaker, and so
I appreciate that. I can tell you, timing is everything, really. When I think about this time in history and everything that we've been through, and the experience that I had by not succeeding the first time around, and the things I learned along the way, especially being in radio and business advocacy, I think I'm really ready for the challenges right now, and it's an important time in Alberta history, and it's an important time in Canadian history. So I'm glad that Albertans gave me another chance.
Well, and I think you're not just working for Albertans, you're working for all Canadians, and you did that during. You talk about challenges. The big challenge right now is, of course, a potential tariff from Donald Trump and the United States of 25%. It could be a trade war. We don't want a trade war. You don't want a trade war. And you were the backbone of the Canadian tariff negotiation team. I mean, all I saw from other premiers was caving in to the idea that natural resources don't belong to provinces. What sort of relationship did you develop with Donald Trump during the times that you were negotiating with him? You were, of course, a guest at his inauguration. You were at Mar-a-Lago. What kind of relationship can you say you have with the president right now? And is he somebody that Canada can work with, especially if we get a new government, preferably with Pierre Poilievre as prime minister?
Well, I had a couple of opportunities to meet him. I went to Mar-a-Lago at the invitation of Kevin O'Leary, and then the next day to his golf club, and then was at the inauguration as well. And it does seem to me that the President Trump is the ultimate decision maker. That's one of the things that I've learned by talking to those who are around him. And our job as subnational government leaders is to reach out to as many contacts as we can to talk to those who have influence on him, so that we can change the pathway and the trajectory that we now find ourselves on. I think that there is a pathway with diplomacy. I think we have an incredible argument to make about the way in which our integrated economies help to support not only our interests, but also create great American jobs, produce great American products that Canadians buy back in larger volumes than anyone else on the planet. And this is a relationship that we should maintain. And we're in a bit of a rocky patch. There's no doubt about it. But I would say that as long as we are identifying the things that are in our mutual interest to solve, I think that we're going to be able to avoid tariffs. When the president said he was worried about fentanyl, we needed to get serious about fentanyl, and it took a little while to get there, but now we have a fentanyl czar. We've identified cartels that are terrorist groups to give us more tools to be able to dismantle them. We're all hands on deck when it comes to finding the 10,000 personnel that we need to make sure that we're addressing the issue from a law enforcement and border security point of view. And we've really stepped up efforts, as you can see, with the amount of seizures that have taken place at the border, the stopping of illegal migrants, and the law enforcement that's taking place. So I think all of that is being acknowledged, and there will always be irritants in this relationship that we have with the United States. So let's just make sure that we're dealing with the security issues, the legitimate security issues that are being raised, and then we can get on to talking about some of those other irritants and hopefully keep this 99% tariff-free relationship going.
So we have this 30-day reprieve. Justin Trudeau agreed to do something about the border. We have a fentanyl czar. I think that's, as you said, a positive step. What concerns me, though, about Trudeau's fix-it plan for the border, two things. There's no 10,000 frontline personnel at the border. I don't see anybody coming soon. The defense minister has said they're not going to be military people. They can't be RCMP. And we don't have CBSA agents in sufficient numbers to do it. So I don't know what Trudeau meant by frontline personnel, except it's a very nebulous term. The second thing that bothers me about his plan is his $1.3 billion over 6 years. Most of that money is projected to be spent in years 5 and 6. In fact, Trudeau is spending more money this year on the gun grab than he is on border security. Does it bother you that he's not entirely serious about border security?
Well, I think that's why he had to come up with a more robust plan. The initial plan was announced, and as you point out, didn't pass in the legislature or in the parliament because they prorogued. And there was only a very small amount that was to be spent this year, I think $81 million. They since came back to the table with the announcement of a fentanyl czar who's now in place, the announcement that $200 million would be spent this year. And they've started rolling out Black Hawk helicopters, which is very key to managing such a large border that we have. I look at it a slightly different way. That there are 8,500 border security and RCMP, and that is a good base to build on. And then I believe that the rest of the security issues do have to be made up with local law enforcement and provincial law enforcement. One of the issues around the border when it comes to the operations of cartels and when it comes to the flow of drugs and the precursors to make them, some of that is stopping it before it gets to the border. We've seen that. We shut down 3 super labs for fentanyl in our province. And so that, to me, if we can seize the drugs in the place that they're being created and then shut those labs down, that helps with border security. That helps make sure it doesn't get into the United States. We also shut down drug houses. We also have fugitive apprehension. And these are all policing functions. So I would say that the issue in Canada is slightly different than in Mexico. Mexico, they have people who are streaming across the border. I think in numbers like 2,000 to 3,000 per day was what was happening prior to the most recent crackdown. That's not the same nature of the problem that we have here. So it means that we have to use slightly different tools. We've got to look at money laundering. We've got to look at our financial institutions. We've got to look at what's happening. If there's money laundering through casinos, this has been alleged in different provinces. If we can take an all hands on deck approach using all of our different law enforcement mechanisms, I think the end result will be fewer drugs on the streets in Canadian cities, but also fewer drugs going across the border.
I found it interesting, too, that the Trudeau administration has actually admitted there's a problem at the Vancouver ports with the precursors for fentanyl getting in. And of course, they love to say it's only 1% across the border, but only 1% is actually being examined at the border. So I think the fentanyl crisis is a lot larger than we have ever been told. And there's a lot of journalists working on that story right now. And I hope I'm one of them.
Right.
But
because part of the issue is that these precursors, there is legitimate industrial uses for them, and so that's part of why we have to identify them and make sure that we're tracking them appropriately. But I think that the fact that they've also identified that we need to do a better job of tracking those precursors, that's also a recognition that whether it's coming in through the ports or whether it's coming in through trucks across the border, there has to be a lot more vehicle inspection. There has to be sniffer dogs, which are some of the ones that we're deploying with our sheriff's team. And you have to have people trained in looking for secret compartments. So I think it's a combination. The ports is also going to have to require the same kind of scrutiny. The idea that we would only check 1% of containers coming in or 1% of trucks and cars coming across the border, I think we now recognize that is not giving the kind of confidence to even our own people that the flow of drugs and guns and other illegal activity is not going two ways. And so I'm glad to see that the federal government is making those investments, that all the provinces are putting their resources to bear on it. And I think it'll lead to safer communities for all of us.
during the period when we were actively looking at this tariff as being a real thing, you were fighting tooth and nail to enforce Alberta's authority to manage its natural resources. A lot of people said, hey, you're putting Alberta first when you do that. That's not Canada first. I said many times on this program and in my columns, I said, no, Danielle Smith is not putting Alberta first. She's putting Canada first because the Canadian Constitution gives natural resources to the provinces. And you pointed that out time after time. Are you concerned if we go back to stage one again and we're looking at tariffs that the federal government is going to try to steal Alberta's natural resources by putting tariffs or duties on exports to the United States?
I think that's the thing we have to be aware of, that when you do end up in a situation of tit for tat tariffs, normally it's import tariffs. So look, if we all end up having to pay a little bit more for orange juice as a way of demonstrating to the Americans that we're just not going to put up with unfair tariffs, that's one thing. But to single out Alberta Energy for an export tariff that could, if it was applied at 25%, generate $40 billion for Ottawa, because tariffs go to Ottawa, so that they can distribute it to places that are more friendly to voting Liberal. That's an equalization program. We've seen that newsreel many times before. We fought that in Peter Lougheed's day when the original Trudeau tried to impose an export tariff, and we simply will not allow for that. We know that if there's any agreement to that kind of approach, we'll never get rid of it. And this is the kind of thing that the federal government has been trying to do to us time and time again. That's one part of it. The other part is we have spent the last number of years invoking the 1977 Pipeline Treaty to prevent Line 5 from getting shut down. That's important on two fronts, because I did ask the federal government to take a look at a map so that they could see that the way in which the Line 5 that terminates in Sarnia is fed is it comes down through Michigan. And if you start talking about using energy as a war by cutting off supply, that puts the Ontario and Quebec citizenry in greater peril, because 100% of the product they get comes by way of the United States or comes by way of shipments from overseas. Why? Because they wouldn't let us build a pipeline, Energy East, to be able to feed the consumer market there. So you should not ever be playing with something as dangerous as that. And why do we have a 1977 pipeline treaty? It says that we will not impede the flow of energy as a vital resource to or from the United States and to or from Canada. So I would say that there was maybe a little, I don't know if it was chest beating, maybe a little posturing, but we have to be practical. We should only ever put forward any kind of measures that we know we can act on. That is one we cannot act on, because the treaty prevents it, number one, but because it'd be devastating to Ontario and Quebec, number two. And people need to understand a little bit more about where their energy comes from.
You pointed out in the past that Justin Trudeau often likes to poke a stick at Donald Trump. For instance, he made the comment about, isn't it a shame that Kamala Harris didn't win the presidential election? And that was a repudiation of women's rights. Couldn't have come at a worse time. Of course, Donald Trump resented that remark. The people decided who would be president in the United States. I wonder sometimes, though, do you think Justin Trudeau and the Liberal Party, especially Mark Carney or anyone else who might be anointed as the next leader and then prime minister, do you think they actually want a trade war with the United States because it helps them to find an enemy that they can run against? They're not going to be successful against Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. I think the Conservatives still have a healthy lead, but it's easier to run against Donald Trump, against the American enemy. And I don't know why we continue to talk about a trade war right now, why it's all buy Canadian, don't buy American goods, because we're supposed to be getting back to normalcy. But do you think Trudeau's encouraging this?
You know where I thought you were going to go when you said, do you think the Liberals even want, I thought you were going to say, do you think the Liberals even want a female leader? Because they've got 3 female leadership candidates to choose from, and everyone keeps talking about the male candidate who's only been back in Canada for 5 minutes. So I find that interesting, that the Liberals love to talk about what feminists they are. And yet I think they're the only major political party at the federal level, and even among many provincial parties, that have yet to choose a female leader. Just put that out there for consideration. But on your other point, I would hope that's not true. I would hope that you don't have a group of leadership candidates that are gunning for a fight. Everybody gets hurt by a tariff war. We are 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy. We cannot win a tariff war if it's tit for tat, 25% across the board tariffs. And tariffs hurt American consumers when the U.S. president applies them, and they hurt Canadian consumers if the Canadian government applies them. At a time when we've had an inflation crisis, a supply chain crisis, an affordability crisis, I would say that the very best approach, this is why I have taken the approach of diplomacy, we should be avoiding these tariffs altogether. We should be doing the things that we need to do to address these issues that the Americans have raised, but because they're good for us too. It's good for us to meet our 2% NATO commitment and be a reliable partner in international security. We should have Arctic security as top of mind to prevent against threats from Russia and China trying to invade our territorial waters. We should want to stop fentanyl on our streets so it's not killing our people. So it may well be that these issues being raised by the U.S. president are ones that are a priority to him, but they should be a priority to us too. And we shouldn't be itching for a fight. A fight on this kind of front is devastating to millions of jobs, millions of families. And I would really hope that isn't on the mind of any of the Liberal leadership contenders.
Well, I'll get you out of here on this one, Premier. That's the final question. If things go off the rails again, if we are facing this tariff, are you prepared to go back to Washington and to deal with Donald Trump? Because Mr. Trump, President Trump, seems to look at you as somebody he can negotiate with. He respects you. It's quite obvious. And I think he likes you as a leader. Are you prepared to go down, not just to fight for Alberta, but as you did previously, are you prepared to go back to fight for Canada?
Well, look, I don't want to overstate it, but I recognize that the relationship between Canada and the U.S. is prime minister to president. And it's very important that we have a prime minister in that chair who has a 4-year mandate, because they're the ones who are going to be negotiating our international trade deals. What I can do is put the issues on the table that I think we've been able to do successfully so far. I mean, the provinces have a voice. The fact that the feds are now talking about our NATO commitment and NORAD bases and Arctic security and fentanyl czars, that's because it's the premiers who've been saying you've got to address these issues in a serious way. I think the reason why, when they were talking about 25% tariffs, that they were prepared to give a 10% tariff on energy resources is because of the arguments that we're making about how the U.S. is reliant on oil and gas and critical minerals and electricity, and all of that allows the Americans to make products more cost effectively and create American jobs. I think that those are arguments that will resonate, whether we're talking about energy, whether we're talking about food. It's the same argument on food, it's the same argument on timber, and it's even the same argument on intermediate goods like auto parts. It's part of our job to make sure that we're filling in the information gaps and making sure that we've got advocates that we're connecting with in the United States who can make the case for us. We've been particularly successful, I think, at making that case on energy, but I'm prepared to make it on every product we and our Canadian allies produce, because I think that this tariff-free relationship is an important one to maintain. And so so the short answer, which I haven't been very short on it, is yes, I will go to the United States as often as I need to. I'll be going down to CERA Week, which is their big energy conference in Houston in March. And I'm hoping that we'll be able to have a really constructive conversation about how we might be able to get more oil and gas pipelines built so that we can help with the U.S. aspiration of energy dominance. I think that's important for global energy security.
Premier Danielle Smith, thank you so much for the time. I tell you, when I do a story with Danielle Smith, the comment section is incredible. It goes wild because people on this show really like the work you're doing. Of all the political leaders in this country and around the world, they love Donald Trump. They love Pierre Poilievre, but they really, really like Danielle Smith, because I think you are doing the job that needs to be done. And I encourage you, for whatever it's worth, keep fighting, not just for Alberta, because Alberta is the home of people who have never taken anything from the federal government, or a Trudeau, whether it was Pierre Trudeau when Peter Lougheed was fighting back, or whether it's Justin Trudeau and you have fought back. But Alberta has always led the way for Canada, a strong Canada. And I believe that very strongly. And all I can say is keep fighting, not just for your province that you're leading so ably and capably, but for Canada, because Canadians love you too, Danielle.
Well, thank you, David. I've always felt that when Alberta does well, Canada does well. So we just want to keep on doing what we do. And we think the entire country will benefit from us. So thanks for those very kind words.
Thanks for joining me today, and we'll stay in touch.
You bet. Bye now.
Was my interview with Premier Danielle Smith from Alberta. It was a pleasure. Thank you for watching today. And please, we welcome your comments. Hopefully, we'll be talking to Pierre Poilievre in the next couple of weeks. Again, this is somebody I've known for a long time, but Pierre as well is reaching out to a lot of shows in the new media and the independent media, because that's where the audience is, people like you and I. Thanks for watching. I'll be back again tomorrow with all the news you need to know. Let's continue to resolve to resist this Liberal government, this Trudeau tyranny. Thank you, and goodbye for now.